Imagine a promise so grand it would shape the destiny of millions, a vision that begins in the heart of ancient Mesopotamia. What if I told you this covenant is still shaping our world today? Stay with me to uncover the twists and turns of this epic journey, from divine visions to millennia of struggle, and find out how it all connects to us today. And hey, if you love deep dives into history with a twist, hit that like button, subscribe, and share the story with someone who'd love this adventure. The story begins in ancient Mesopotamia, where Abraham, a devout man of faith, receives a divine vision. In the vision, a majestic figure surrounded by radiant light promises him a covenant. His descendants will inherit a land flowing with milk and honey. Abraham, torn between faith and the enormity of the promise, stands on a hill overlooking Canaan. The tension builds as the covenant is sealed with a celestial display, marking the beginning of a millennia-long struggle. Years later, Abraham's two sons, Isaac and Ishmael, grow up with different destinies. The narrative shifts to a family rift as Hagar, Ishmael's mother, is sent away. The seeds of division are sown, with Ishmael and Hagar wandering the desert while Isaac becomes heir to the covenant. The emotional weight of a father's divided heart is palpable. Isaac grows into a man of faith and raises his son Jacob, who later wrestles with an angel in a fateful encounter, earning the name Israel. Jacob's 12 sons lay the foundation for the 12 tribes. Meanwhile, Ishmael's descendants become nomadic tribes of the desert. Tensions simmer between the families as oral traditions diverge over who holds the rightful claim to the covenant. This rivalry sets the stage for centuries of conflict. Centuries pass, and Jacob's descendants, enslaved in Egypt, cry out for freedom. Moses emerges as their leader, and through divine intervention, he leads the Israelites out of bondage. As they wander the desert, the covenant is reaffirmed through the Ten Commandments. Meanwhile, Ishmael's descendants flourish as traders and warriors, spreading across the Arabian Peninsula. The Israelites eventually settle in Canaan, forming a united monarchy under King David and King Solomon. Jerusalem becomes the spiritual and political heart of their kingdom. The construction of Solomon's temple is a moment of divine triumph. However, cracks begin to form as neighboring tribes, including Ishmael's descendants, challenge Israelite sovereignty. The united monarchy fractures into two kingdoms, Israel and Judah. Civil war and moral decay weaken the Israelites. Ishmael's descendants, growing into powerful tribes, watch from afar as Assyrian and Babylonian forces conquer the Israelite kingdoms. Jerusalem falls, and the temple is destroyed, scattering the Israelites. The exiles carry with them the dream of returning to their promised land. The scattered Israelites cling to prophetic visions of restoration. Ezekiel speaks of dry bones rising, a metaphor for their return to the land. Ishmael's descendants, now flourishing as Arab tribes, establish trade routes and cultural hubs, solidifying their legacy in the region. The two family lines remain aware of each other's presence, their rivalry dormant but unforgotten. Centuries later, the Israelites return and rebuild Jerusalem, only to face Roman conquest. During this time, Ishmael's descendants are now a widespread people influencing culture, language, and trade. The temple is rebuilt, but destroyed again during a failed Jewish revolt against Rome. The loss is devastating, yet the Israelites retain their spiritual connection to the land. In the 7th century, the emergence of Islam reshapes the religious and geopolitical landscape. Ishmael's descendants, now united under the teachings of Prophet Muhammad, establish a vast empire that encompasses Jerusalem. The Dome of the Rock is built on the Temple Mount, symbolizing their spiritual claim to the city. For the Israelites, the loss of control over Jerusalem deepens their yearning for restoration. The arrival of the Crusaders in the 11th century shakes the region. The First Crusade ends in 1099 with the Siege of Jerusalem, where Christian knights massacre its Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. For Crusaders, it's a victory. For Muslims, a tragedy. In the late 12th century, Saladin, a Kurdish Muslim leader, unites Muslim states and recaptures Jerusalem in 1187 after the Battle of Hadden, gaining fame for both military skill and generosity. Jerusalem remains a battleground for ideologies, central to all three Abrahamic faiths. The Crusades deepened Christian-Muslim animosity and heightened Jewish despair, leaving lasting scars and fueling division for centuries. As the Middle Ages progress, Jewish communities in Europe and the Middle East face hardship. In Europe, Jews are confined to ghettos, expelled, and blamed for societal problems, while pogroms spread fear and displacement. Despite this, Jewish culture thrives in pockets, with scholars producing texts like the Talmud and thinkers like Maimonides enriching Jewish thought. In Muslim lands, Jews experience tolerance under Islamic rule, but remain second-class citizens. Across the diaspora, the hope of returning to Zion endures, especially during the Passover Seder, when families recite, "Next year in Jerusalem." For Muslims, Jerusalem is a prized city, second only to Mecca and Medina. The Al-Aqsa Mosque and Dome of the Rock cement its importance in Islamic heritage. Despite tensions, the city becomes a cultural melting pot, with shared Jewish and Muslim histories intertwining under Islamic rule. However, their differing views on the city's divine significance lay the groundwork for future conflict and rival claims when modern nationalism arises. The Ottoman Empire takes control of Jerusalem in 1517, bringing centuries of stability. Under Ottoman rule, the city becomes a multicultural hub for Jews, Muslims, and Christians, with the Ottomans preserving sacred sites like the Dome of the Rock and Western Wall. Jews are allowed to pray at the wall and settle in small numbers, while Muslims maintain the city's spiritual and political significance. By the 19th century, Ottoman rule weakens due to corruption, and European powers like Britain and France gain influence. Jewish immigration to Palestine increases, creating tension with the Arab population. The Ottoman era, though relatively peaceful, sets the stage for future conflicts, with Jerusalem's coexistence strained by rising nationalisms. In the late 19th century, Zionism emerges as a political movement calling for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, led by Theodor Herzl after witnessing European anti-Semitism. Pogroms and the Dreyfus Affair highlight Jewish insecurity, prompting Herzl to organize the first Zionist Congress in 1897, where a resolution for a Jewish home in Palestine is adopted. Jewish migration increases, with settlers establishing kibbutzim and reviving Hebrew. Meanwhile, Palestinian Arabs, whose ancestral home the land is, grow uneasy. Arab leaders begin advocating for resistance to Zionism, marking the beginning of modern conflict as both Jews and Arabs claim the same land, setting the stage for 20th-century territorial and ideological battles. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire during World War I reshapes the Middle East, with Britain and France dividing the region under the Sykes-Picot Agreement. In 1917, Britain issues the Balfour Declaration, supporting a Jewish homeland in Palestine. For Jews, it is a key step in the Zionist movement, but for Palestinians, it feels like a betrayal, as Britain had promised Arab independence. Jewish immigration to Palestine increases, leading to clashes between Jews and Arabs. The Balfour Declaration becomes a symbol of conflicting imperial and nationalist ambitions, setting the stage for future conflict over Palestine. The British Mandate of Palestine begins in 1920, marking a turbulent chapter in the region's history. Britain attempts to balance its commitments to both Jews and Arabs, but its policies often exacerbate tensions. Jewish immigration surges, driven by European anti-Semitism and the rise of Nazism. Arabs, feeling increasingly marginalized, organize protests and strikes. The 1936 to 1939 Arab Revolt is a major turning point as Palestinians rise against British rule and Jewish settlement. The British respond with brutal crackdowns, leaving Palestinian leadership weakened. Meanwhile, Jewish militias like the Haganah and Irgun grow stronger, preparing for future battles. By the end of the Mandate in 1947, Britain is exhausted and unable to manage the escalating violence. The stage is set for the partition of Palestine, as Britain hands the issue over to the newly formed United Nations. As the story unfolds, here's something to ponder. Do you think the struggles between Isaac's and Ishmael's descendants were inevitable, or could they have been avoided with a different choice? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective might spark a fascinating discussion. In 1947, the United Nations proposes the partition of Palestine into two states, one for Jews and one for Arabs. The plan allocates 55% of the land to the Jewish state, despite Jews constituting only 30% of the population. Jewish leaders reluctantly accept, seeing it as a path to statehood. Palestinians, however, reject the plan as a betrayal, viewing it as a colonial imposition that disregards their majority. Clashes intensify, foreshadowing a broader conflict. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion declares the establishment of the State of Israel. For Jews, it is a moment of jubilation, fulfilling centuries of longing. The next day, neighboring Arab nations declare war, determined to destroy the nascent state. The resulting conflict, known as the Arab-Israeli War, leads to the displacement of over 700,000 Palestinians, marking the Nakba, or catastrophe, in Palestinian memory. For Palestinians, 1948 is a year of displacement and devastation. Entire villages are razed, and families are forced to flee, often with nothing but what they can carry. Many find refuge in neighboring countries, living in makeshift camps that become permanent. The Nakba becomes the central trauma of Palestinian identity, fueling decades of resistance and demands for justice. Over time, the displaced Palestinians settle in refugee camps across Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and Gaza. These camps become overcrowded and impoverished, breeding despair and anger. The right of return becomes a rallying cry for Palestinians, but Israel, wary of demographic shifts, denies their claims. Statelessness becomes a defining feature of the Palestinian experience. In 1967, Israel launches a preemptive strike against its neighbors, achieving a stunning victory in just 6 days. Israel captures the West Bank, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. For Israelis, it is a miraculous expansion of their state and fulfillment of prophecy. For Palestinians, it marks the beginning of an enduring occupation, intensifying their demands for statehood. Following the Six-Day War, Israel begins building settlements in the occupied territories. These settlements are viewed by Palestinians and much of the international community as illegal under international law. The settlements expand over the decades, creating new realities on the ground that complicate peace efforts. In 1987, the First Intifada erupts as Palestinians rise up against Israeli occupation. Protests, boycotts, and clashes dominate daily life. Images of children throwing stones at Israeli tanks become iconic. The uprising underscores the deep frustration of Palestinians living under occupation and galvanizes international attention. In the early 1990s, secret negotiations lead to the Oslo Accords, aimed at resolving the conflict. Both sides agree to a framework for peace, envisioning a two-state solution. While the accords inspire hope, they also spark resistance from hardliners on both sides, who see compromise as betrayal. Despite initial optimism, the Oslo Accords falter as violence escalates. Extremists on both sides, opposed to compromise, sabotage peace efforts. The assassination of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in 1995 marks a turning point. Trust erodes, and tensions explode into the Second Intifada in 2000. This uprising is bloodier than the first, marked by suicide bombings, military incursions, and widespread destruction. For Palestinians, the Intifada is a desperate cry for freedom. For Israelis, it is a relentless assault on their security. As the Palestinian Authority struggles to govern, Hamas rises in influence, advocating for armed resistance. In 2006, Hamas wins elections in Gaza, creating a rift with Fatah, which controls the West Bank. The division weakens the Palestinian cause and complicates negotiations. Gaza becomes a flashpoint, enduring blockades, airstrikes, and militant rocket fire. The humanitarian crisis deepens, with civilians bearing the brunt of the violence. Israeli settlements in the West Bank grow rapidly, fueled by religious and political motivations. For settlers, the land is a divine inheritance. For Palestinians, it is an encroachment on their future state. The separation barrier, intended to prevent attacks, becomes a symbol of division. The wall carves through Palestinian villages, isolating communities and severing connections. The sight of olive trees uprooted for construction becomes a poignant symbol of loss. The international community becomes increasingly involved, with the United States, the UN, and the EU proposing peace initiatives. However, mistrust and political stalemates derail efforts. The Arab Spring brings new uncertainties, with regional upheavals shifting alliances. For Israelis, the world feels increasingly hostile, and for Palestinians, the promises of justice remain unfulfilled. The two-state solution seems ever more elusive. Amid the political wrangling, ordinary people on both sides continue to suffer. In Gaza, blockades lead to shortages of food, medicine, and clean water. In Israel, rocket attacks disrupt daily life, forcing families into bomb shelters. NGOs and activists document the human cost, amplifying calls for justice and peace. For children, growing up amid violence and fear, the conflict becomes a lifelong trauma. As new generations come of age, perspectives evolve. Activists on both sides work to humanize their opponents, sharing stories of loss and resilience. Social media becomes a powerful tool, spreading awareness but also fueling propaganda. The conflict is no longer confined to the region, it becomes a global debate, with protests and solidarity movements rising worldwide. The narrative ends with a reflection on the enduring complexities of the conflict. It acknowledges the deep wounds and hopes for reconciliation. Both Israelis and Palestinians remain steadfast in their claims, yet the possibility of peace lies in their shared humanity. The story closes with a vision of Jerusalem, its ancient stones bathed in golden light, symbolizing the sacred ties that bind and the potential for unity. We've traversed centuries, from Abraham's divine vision to the enduring legacies of his descendants. What does this story teach us about resilience, faith, and the power of promises? Let me know in the comments, and if you found this journey as captivating as I did, give this video a thumbs up, share it with your fellow history buffs, and make sure to subscribe for more untold stories that connect our past to the present. Until next time, keep exploring the roots of our shared humanity.